So this patch is called Ersatz Grainz. And the idea behind it is twofold. One, I was experimenting with the granular module and loopers and trying to get this sort of granular cloud sound and not having a ton of success with it. So that leads to the other idea behind this, which was to replace a granular module with a sort of self-made granular module built from delay lines and enveloped VCAs. And so those are the two major components of this. The VCAs envelopes are randomized. They're randomized in length. And each time they close, the delay lines resize. The length of the delay line buffer changes. These are non-interpolated delay lines, and so when that happens, it starts reading from a different part of the buffer. And so you get this sort of granular effect where audio is sort of chopped up and repositioned, both by the VCAs, which are shaping the volume of that audio, but also by these buffers that are continuously resizing and sampling from different points in that playback. So the controls focus on delay lines and envelopes, basically. But across the top, we have a minimum time. This is sort of the smallest amount of buffer. It can get quite low and you can get some interesting reverb effects. I'll try to show those off in a minute. It involves changing some things around. You can also clock this amount using a tap tempo or MIDI clock. So if you wanted to have sort of a reference to some external clock, there's still randomization going on, but it would sort of be this foundation time frame. Then there's the time variation control, which determines the amount of randomness that can be applied to these buffer lengths. And, it's proportionate in such a way that as the minimum time increases, the space for randomization decreases, so that you don't end up with randomizations that go sort of over the buffer length. But you can go over the buffer length with this last control, which is the time spread control. If the variation is set very low, which there are reasons you might want to do that, particularly if you're clocking it, but you still want a little bit of variation, then all of the delay lines would sort of be in a very small range. The time spread, what it does is it multiplies the minimum time for each of the 6 granular buffers. There are 6 of these modules or circuits or whatever you want to call them in the patch. You see them represented. Each of these flashing lights represents one of the different buffers. And with the time spread, this is also proportionate. So you can sort of get a range. When it's at 1, the minimum time for each of the buffers will be a multiple of the minimum time. And I should say the buffer length is up to 4 seconds. That seemed like sort of a good range to put everything in. So, as the minimum time is multiplied, you get these buffers that are spaced out more and more in time. I keep using the word time, but the longest buffer will draw from the most distant past, because it's a longer delay line. And the addition of that multiple can go up to the, I mean, it can't go over the buffer because that's a hard limit, but you could have, depending on where the other controls are set, you could have a couple of delay lines that are right up at that 4 second mark. So that's something to keep in mind. It's just, balancing all of that. But I think it adds a nice variety to the delay lines. They don't all sort of sample from the same moment. Then we have feedback. Feedback, feedback feeds the audio both into its own buffer and into the next buffer. Sort of splits the signal, and you get feedback going into two different buffers at once. And the feedback is also shaped by the envelope. So you get this scattering of sound across these different buffers. So that's the delay side. The envelope side is a similar sort of approach. There's a minimum envelope time, and the envelopes go up to, I don't remember this offhand, I think 3 seconds. But the minimum sets the minimum amount of time that they can occupy. And again, we can clock this if we want. And then we have, again, a variation control. So this determines how much the envelopes can be extended beyond that minimum time. And then there's amplitude variation. This is a randomization of the amplitude of each of the envelopes. As you turn that down, they'll all have the same amplitude. And we actually see that reflected in the lights. This will be a bit louder. I generally keep that maxed out, but you could, if you wanted to have a little bit more consistency in the envelopes, you could adjust that control or in the volume, because there will be times where the grains are louder or quieter because of that variation. That may be something you want to avoid. And then we have sort of controls over the shape. The shape skews from at 0, it's a pure decay. At 1, it's a ramp. And in the middle, you get a triangular shape. That's sort of the smoothest sound. As we move it toward that triangular shape, it can get pretty percussive. And then in the ramp position, you get this sort of pseudo reverse sound as you get your expectation of the sound is that it'll decay, but it sort of rises in volume. And you can get anywhere in between those two shapes. So if you want something that's a little bit subtler than the extremes, those options are available. We have a hold option. This is not, so we have attack and decay based on the shape. The hold time is not randomized. It's consistent. So if you wanted to have sort of a consistent envelope time, we could turn these other controls down and we would just end up with very consistent grain sizes. Since they're all triggered at different times because these envelopes were varied beforehand, you'll get some differences in when they occur, although you can end up in situations where they're all pretty close to one another. And then finally, there's a linear switch. So we added on linear, and that uses a linear curve to the envelopes. When the linear button is off, the curve is exponential. Let's turn hold time back down. This is probably pretty close to where I had it. So we get a much more swelling sort of sound, I'd say, a little bit less distinct. And we have a pan spread, which can go all the way, fully panned at 1. Or you can tighten it up to a much narrower field. I like something somewhere in between those two. I should say that the patch passes stereo audio from the dry signal, and the output of the affected signal, the wet signal, is in stereo, but it sums to mono before engaging in these granular activities. And then we have a density control, so as you turn that down, basically some of the envelopes just won't fire. So that can be a way to sort of thin out the sound or add a little bit more variety to it. Then we have dry level and input gain as opposed to a wet level. This is just a CPU saver. Because I'm summing to mono, I can use a VCA at the input to control how much gain goes into the circuit instead of a VCA at the output, controlling both channels. So it's a little bit different approach to a mixer in the way that I would probably ideally prefer, but it's not a bad compromise, I don't think. And I say that because you might see that in a couple of other patches I'm planning on releasing soon. So those are all the controls. There's only one stomp switch. It's for the tap tempo. I do want to show off this sort of reverby thing that you can do with it, because I think it's pretty cool. So you got to take the minimum time down really low. And you've got to take the variation down really low. Although it can be interesting to have a really low minimum time and a longer variation, because then you can get some mixture of sort of what happens with the minimum time and the time variation being down very low is you get very short delay lines, and because they're essentially looped while the envelope is open, you get these comb filtering, flanging sort of things. But we need this for our sort of pseudo reverb. We need this pretty low, and we'll bring the feedback up higher. And then we get a sound like which I think is really interesting, particularly as you turn the time variation up just a little bit. We can change the envelopes. Let's try something pretty short. But as the envelopes get longer, we also get sort of longer periods of feedback on a really sort of short comb filtery sort of delay line. Let's try changing the shape a little bit, maybe a sort of reversey. I'm not trying to push the feedback too far, because you can play around with it. There are points where it will get pretty resonant, which is cool, but I don't want to necessarily blast out people's ears during a walkthrough. But also it can overload the circuit. Now this, in my experience, won't result in sort of runaway oscillation. It'll just sort of choke out the sound. You won't hear anything come out of the circuit. So if that happens, try pulling back the feedback, try changing the envelope lengths. But that's Ersatz Grainz. I think, it's a sort of different take on Granular in ZOIA. And one that I think, again, achieves some things that probably are possible with the Granular module, but require a bit more work. Whereas here, I think they're a little bit easier to come by. So I hope you enjoy it. If you check it out and you like it, please like it on Patch Storage. And that's the video. Bye.